She stood there, in the quiet plane cabin, facing the cold stares of dozens of passengers. But not a single person spoke up. When the flight attendant placed her hand on her shoulder, asking her to leave the seat she had bought with her sweat and honor, Madeline Carter simply stood up in silence. No anger, no resistance. Just one message sent. And from that moment, everything began to change. A story of quiet determination, of the power of dignity, and of how an ordinary person can rewrite invisible rules. You won't be able to take your eyes off this journey. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any new videos. Now let's begin following the incredible journey of Madeline Carter. She boarded the plane quietly in her crisply ironed uniform, holding a first-class ticket in her hand. No noise, no demands, just a soldier silently on her journey home. Only a few minutes after she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached, surveyed her from head to toe, and then uttered words that made the entire cabin fall silent. "You shouldn't be sitting here." Forced to leave her seat, the young woman was pushed to the economy section, right in front of the gaze of dozens of strangers. Not a single person spoke up in her defense. Not a single question was asked. She didn't resist. She simply took out her phone and sent a brief message, a message that seemed small, but ended up changing everything. Before the plane could land, the pilot received an urgent call. The airline scrambled into crisis management mode. The flight attendant had no idea that she had just disrespected someone she should never have touched. The story that followed will make you think about how many people have been treated unfairly like this without anyone speaking up. Keep following, because what happens next will be far beyond anything you could imagine. As the plane's door was about to close, Madeline Carter entered, her military boots lightly tapping on the floor of the cabin. Her crisp uniform and steady gait reflected the years of serious training she had undergone. She wasn't here to cause a scene. All Madeline wanted was a quiet rest after months of working far from home. This was her first flight home, and the unexpected gift from her father, a first-class ticket, was his way of quietly expressing his pride. When he handed her the ticket, he simply nodded and said softly, "You deserve it." For Madeline, that was more than enough. Madeline slowly walked down the aisle, searching for seat 2B by the window. She sat down, neatly folded her military jacket, and placed her backpack under the seat in front of her. A few passengers glanced at her, some offering polite smiles, others indifferent. It didn't bother her. She closed her eyes, relaxed, letting the weight of the past year slowly drift from her mind. But that peace didn't last long. A flight attendant quickly walked down the aisle. On her name tag was Miss Sullivan, tall, angular, with her hair neatly tied back, holding a clipboard. She smiled, but the smile seemed forced. "Ms." Sullivan's gaze scanned Madeline's face, then the seat number, and finally stopped at her military uniform. "Excuse me," she said, her tone coldly polite. "May I check your boarding pass?" Madeline opened her eyes, slightly surprised, but still politely handed her the ticket. Ms. Sullivan glanced at the ticket briefly, lips pressed together tightly. "This is a first-class ticket." "That's right," Madeline replied calmly. "It's my seat." "Ms." Sullivan's smile became even more strained. "Are you traveling alone?" Madeline nodded in confirmation. The flight attendant held onto the ticket a moment longer, as though hoping it would change on its own, then handed it back, her voice lowering, colder. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake. This area is for premium passengers only." Madeline frowned. "But this is my seat." Ms. Sullivan didn't back down. She leaned in, lowered her voice, but became more firm. "I'm asking you to move to economy class. There might be a mistake with your ticket, or someone might have gifted it to you, but we need to sort this out before takeoff." Madeline blinked. "This ticket was purchased by my father." Ms. Sullivan snapped curtly. "I'm sure it was well-meaning, but we need to follow the procedure." Without waiting any longer, she gently but firmly placed her hand on Madeline's arm, signaling her to leave the seat. A few passengers nearby started to notice. Some whispered, others quietly looked down at their phones. Not one person stood up. Madeline slowly stood up. She didn't get angry, nor did she raise her voice. She simply packed her things, adjusted her posture, and quietly walked to the back of the plane. No one dared look directly at her. No one said a word. She found an empty seat in the economy section, sat down. The seat was smaller, the space tighter, but what hurt her wasn't the inconvenience. It was the way things had unfolded, as if she didn't belong there, as if she had done something wrong. Her hands slightly trembling, Madeline opened her backpack, took out her phone. She typed a short message to her father. "They made me move to economy, saying I don't belong in that seat. I didn't argue, but they touched me. I'm fine, just upset." After sending it, she placed the phone face down on her lap and stared ahead, quietly knowing that this wasn't over yet. Madeline sat up straight in her seat, her hands neatly resting in her lap. She focused on the back of the seat in front of her, while her mind spun. She had been trained to stay calm in pressure situations, but no training had prepared her for the humiliation of being judged so hastily by someone else. Her phone buzzed lightly. She looked down. A message from her father, short and unusually cold. "What happened?" "From the beginning." Madeline clenched her jaw and quickly typed a reply. "She saw my uniform, asked to see my ticket. Even though I showed it to her, she insisted I move, saying the seat was for premium passengers. She even touched my arm." The message was sent, and a silence stretched on like it lasted a century. Then her phone buzzed again. "Give me the flight number." Madeline read and reread the message. She knew the tone of her father's voice. It wasn't a casual question. It was a sign. Action was about to begin. Madeline Carter knew well that her father, Commander Samuel Carter, was someone who understood how systems operated, not just in the military, but across various fields. When he requested specific information, such as the flight number, it meant that action was already being prepared. Without hesitation, Madeline quickly typed the flight number and put her phone back in her bag. She leaned her head against the airplane window, gazing out at the vast sky, trying to remain calm, even as a mix of emotions swirled inside her. In the first-class cabin ahead, Ms. Sullivan continued to walk around, serving drinks to passengers, wearing a courteous smile as though nothing had happened. The way she behaved, her arrogant expression, made Madeline feel a quiet, smoldering anger building inside her. Near the kitchen area, a young flight attendant named Emily, who had witnessed the entire event, approached Ms. Sullivan and hesitated before asking quietly, "Is there really an issue with her ticket?" Ms. Sullivan didn't bother looking up, arranging trays of drinks as she replied, "She doesn't look like the kind of person who should be sitting in this section. Usually, that's a red flag. Sometimes passengers use someone else's ticket to sneak into premium seating." Emily frowned, annoyed. "But she showed you her boarding pass, right?" Ms. Sullivan smirked, her response cold. "I've seen enough tricks, Emily. Not everyone deserves to sit here." Emily bit her lip, holding back her emotions. She knew something wasn't right with the way this was being handled. But at that moment, she didn't have the courage to speak up. Meanwhile, Madeline's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her father, brief and firm. "Don't worry, stay calm. I'll take care of it." Madeline closed her eyes, silently reminding herself to stay composed. A feeling told her that this flight was about to take a turn no one had anticipated. In the cockpit, Captain Mason Rivers was carefully monitoring the control panel. When the internal phone on the wall rang, he picked it up out of habit. The voice on the other end was clear and firm. "This is Commander Samuel Carter. I'm calling about a passenger on Flight 382. My daughter, Sergeant Madeline Carter, was forced out of her first-class seat and disrespected in front of other passengers." Captain Rivers straightened in his seat, his expression changing immediately. "Yes, sir. I haven't been briefed about this situation." The voice on the other end continued cold and resolute. "She has been insulted and moved to economy class without just cause. I've contacted the Aviation Security Bureau. An official investigation will be launched. In the meantime, I advise you to immediately verify this with the head flight attendant." The call ended sharply, leaving Captain Rivers stunned as he stared at the control panel, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. Without hesitation, he hit the intercom button. "Ms. Sullivan, please report to the cockpit immediately." In the first-class cabin, Ms. Sullivan froze in the aisle. A moment of confusion flashed across her face, but it was quickly replaced with an annoyed expression. Trying to maintain a neutral face, she turned and walked briskly to the front. Below in economy, Madeline heard the announcement over the intercom. Her hand tightened around her phone in her palm. What was about to happen had already begun. When Ms. Sullivan entered the cockpit, the professional smile she wore quickly faded upon meeting Captain Rivers's cold gaze. "Do you remember the passenger in seat 2B? A soldier?" Ms. Sullivan hesitated, slightly unsure. "Yes. There was a mix-up with the seating. I asked her to move." "Did you check her ticket?" Ms. Sullivan pressed her lips together. "I just glanced at it. But she wasn't on my priority list, so I assumed there was a mistake." Captain Rivers's voice dropped to a stern tone. "You assumed. Didn't verify?" "Ms." Sullivan tried to defend herself. Sir, many passengers wear military uniforms to take advantage of priority seating. I was just following protocol." Captain Rivers's gaze was sharp as a knife. "The person you just humiliated is Sergeant Madeline Carter, daughter of Commander Samuel Carter, currently a senior advisor on national security." Captain Rivers paused for a moment, making sure every word he said was heard. "And he has directly contacted the Aviation Security Bureau. This is now a federal issue." Ms. Sullivan's face went pale. Captain Rivers continued, "Right now you will return to the cabin, apologize to Sergeant Carter in front of the passengers, and personally escort her back to her first-class seat. If you refuse," he said with authority, "this flight will make an emergency landing to address this civil rights violation in the air." With trembling hands, Ms. Sullivan left the cockpit. Never before in her career had she felt so small and alone. The aisle stretched ahead. The faces of the passengers, once oblivious, now seemed to scrutinize her every step. The fake smile had long since disappeared. Ms. Sullivan's eyes scanned the cabin, searching for Madeline, and finally spotting her sitting quietly by the window. She didn't turn her head, didn't show any emotion. But it was that silence that was the most terrifying strength of all. "Mrs." Sullivan bent down to Madeline's eye level, her voice now trembling and much quieter. "Sergeant Carter, there was a misunderstanding. May I escort you back to your first-class seat?" Madeline slowly turned her head, her gaze sharp and cold. "Misunderstanding?" Ms. Sullivan swallowed hard, quickly adding, "Your name didn't appear on the original list. I misunderstood the situation." Madeline remained silent, her eyes fixed on Ms. Sullivan's face, forcing her to confront the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was prejudice and judgment. Madeline Carter calmly held her phone, her fingers gently gliding over the screen as she composed a short message. "She's here, saying there was a misunderstanding, inviting me back to first class." The message was sent. Just seconds later, a message from Commander Samuel Carter appeared on the screen. Make her admit the truth. No accepting vague apologies or procedural excuses. Madeline lifted her gaze, her eyes slowly scanning Ms. Sullivan, who stood in front of her, clearly flustered. With a calm but firm voice, Madeline spoke. You asked me to leave my seat. You said I didn't belong in first class. And you touched me. Ms. Sullivan flinched slightly, stepping back, her voice stammering. It was just a small gesture, no ill intentions. But Madeline didn't let her dodge. You touched me, she repeated, each word clear. And now you want to act as if nothing happened. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Some passengers nearby had turned off their entertainment screens, while others set their drinks down, watching intently. The silence grew heavy, like a thick blanket covering the entire plane. Ms. Sullivan swallowed hard, her throat dry, and whispered, I misjudged the situation. I crossed the line. I apologize for the inconvenience. Madeline raised one eyebrow slightly, her voice not loud but sharp as a knife. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their boarding passes? Only me. Why? The question hung in the air, heavy with significance. All eyes turned to Ms. Sullivan. She looked around, seemingly searching for an escape, but no one was standing by her. Ms. Sullivan's face turned visibly pale. Finally, she lowered her head slightly and muttered, I judged. I was wrong. Madeline slowly stood up, her posture strong, not angry, just quiet and resolute. Say it for everyone to hear. Ms. Sullivan took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain some last bits of confidence. She straightened up, turned to the nearby passengers, and spoke this time, louder and clearer. I was wrong to ask Sergeant Carter to leave her seat. Her ticket is perfectly valid. I unfairly judged her. I apologize. No one in the cabin sneered or mocked, but the silence that followed her statement was heavier than any criticism. Madeline didn't respond. She simply nodded slightly, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and walked back to her first-class seat with steady, confident steps. As she moved forward, the first-class passengers, those who had previously turned their backs on her, now looked up. A few bowed their heads in shame. Others hurriedly avoided her gaze. Not a single word was spoken. She returned to seat 2B, sat down as she had before, neat and composed. Her backpack was carefully pushed under the seat in front of her. Ms. Sullivan trailed behind her a few steps, standing hesitantly beside her, awkwardly as if searching for words. Finally, she spoke in a trembling voice. If there's anything I can do to make up for... Madeline didn't answer. She simply opened the book resting on her lap, flipped to a random page, and stared intently at the text, as if Ms. Sullivan's presence had never existed. Ms. Sullivan blushed, her hands trembling slightly, and hurriedly walked away from Madeline's seat, rushing toward the kitchen at the back. There, Emily had been waiting, her gaze discreet, but betraying the tension she couldn't hide. How did it go? Emily asked softly. Ms. Sullivan sadly shook her head, her voice faltering. I apologized. Emily tried to keep a neutral expression, but couldn't help the light sarcasm that crept into her tone. You looked like you were on trial back there. Ms. Sullivan shot her a sharp glare, snapping, This is not the time for jokes. Emily shrugged. It's just, you didn't think this would be over easily, did you? Ms. Sullivan didn't respond. She quickly grabbed a tray of drinks, pretending to be busy in an attempt to avoid confronting the reality now exposed. That this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Back in first class, Madeline turned a page in her book, but in truth, she wasn't reading. Her eyes skimmed over the words while her mind drifted far away. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The lively chatter, the small talk between passengers when they first boarded, had completely disappeared, replaced by an unusual silence and furtive glances. The man sitting across from her in his dark blue suit leaned toward her hesitantly. I witnessed what just happened. He cleared his throat awkwardly. It's unfortunate. Madeline looked up, her gaze cold. Unfortunate? The man reddened. I'm sure she didn't mean any harm. Madeline tilted her head and asked directly, So when it happened, did you speak up? He stiffened, then awkwardly admitted, No. I didn't think it was my place. Madeline gave a slight nod, her gaze returning to the page in her book. That's the problem. The man lowered his head, suddenly fixated on his nearly full glass of wine, avoiding her gaze. Madeline's phone buzzed. A message from her father. Good. I've got the situation. Stay put. The security team is waiting at the gate. A faint smile briefly appeared at the corner of Madeline's mouth. She didn't reply. No need to. She took a deep breath, turned another page in her book, her mind as calm as a still lake before a storm. Throughout the cabin, the furtive glances continued. No one spoke, but everyone could feel it. A silent earthquake had just shaken the once calm air. Madeline didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her quiet resolve had changed the entire first-class cabin, not through anger, but through the truth. A female passenger sitting nearby nodded slightly when the flight attendant checked in. Her gaze, though brief, quickly scanned Madeline Carter before she returned to her drink tray. Though she tried to act as if nothing had happened, everyone in the cabin understood what had just occurred, and they couldn't keep pretending. Meanwhile, Ms. Sullivan continued to try and maintain her professionalism, walking down the aisle with a forced smile, her voice artificially sweet. As she passed the small kitchen area where Emily was arranging the drink trays, she lowered her head and whispered, I offered her a drink, her voice barely a whisper. Emily didn't look up, continuing her work, and replied calmly, Did she accept? No. She didn't say anything, Ms. Sullivan sighed. Emily smiled faintly, a sad smile. She didn't need to speak. She said enough just by staying silent. Ms. Sullivan's face tightened, her jaw clenched. Do you think they'll blow this out of proportion? I apologized, explained it was just a misunderstanding, she said. Emily stopped for a moment, her gaze rising to meet Ms. Sullivan's, direct and honest. You didn't check her ticket. You touched her. And you judged her just based on the first impression. That's not a small mistake. Ms. Sullivan turned away without responding, a vague fear rising in her chest. She tried to focus on the small tasks like pouring water and folding napkins, but her hands trembled slightly. Every whispered word, every glance that passed by her felt like a dagger piercing her. Miss Sullivan had never felt so isolated, as though the eyes of the entire cabin were on her, silently judging her, even though many pretended to be busy. In the cabin, Madeline turned a page in her book with indifference. Her phone buzzed again. A short message from her father, Commander Samuel Carter. When we land, someone will come to the cabin to find you. Don't leave your seat. Let them approach you first. Madeline simply replied with one word, understood. She placed her phone on the table in front of her, her eyes directed out the window, watching the layers of clouds drifting by. In her life, Madeline had faced countless challenges, the battlefield, natural disasters, life or death decisions in the blink of an eye. But this time, on this calm flight, it was different. The pain didn't come from violence, but from the cold silence, the indifferent turning away of those around her. It wasn't the loss of her seat that hurt the most. It wasn't Ms. Sullivan's dismissive touch. It was the avoidance, the complicit silence of the entire cabin, as if a cold cut had been made to her self-respect. But she also felt clearly that this silence was about to break. Something was silently building up. And this time, Madeline silently vowed, "I won't be the one who quietly leaves." The plane began its descent. Captain Mason Rivers' voice came over the intercom, steady and clear. "Please return to your seats, fasten your seat belts, return your tables to the upright position, and prepare for landing." Passengers began to shift, rearranging their seats, tidying up their belongings. But instead of the usual chatter, a quiet tension subtly spread. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This flight would not end like any other. Madeline had fastened her seatbelt long ago. She sat up straight, her hand lightly resting on the table, her phone still within reach. Her eyes stared straight ahead, calm as if prepared for any scenario. That calmness didn't just come from the message from her father. It also came from the firm belief that those who look down on others will eventually have to face the consequences. In the back, Emily quietly passed down the aisle, collecting glasses and checking the cabin. When she reached Madeline, she paused for a moment, bent low, and whispered, "If you need anything before landing, just let me know." Madeline looked up and nodded briefly. "Thank you." Emily's face softened slightly, and she quietly continued her work. Meanwhile, Ms. Sullivan stood frozen in the kitchen area. She no longer dared step outside, no longer dared smile, no longer dared walk past seat 2B. Her uniform collar, once comfortably fitted, now felt suffocating. Her hands trembled as she folded the small napkins. Every glance, every whisper that reached her, or that she imagined, felt like a sentence hanging above her head. Emily quietly returned to the kitchen, her voice soft. "They'll meet her at the gate." Ms. Sullivan jumped slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily didn't look up. "There's a security team waiting," the captain confirmed. "Ms." Sullivan whispered, trying to deny it. "She's just a soldier." Emily cut her off, for the first time speaking sharply. "She's the one who was pushed out of her seat because you didn't even bother to check her ticket. No further excuses could save her." The plane tilted and slowly descended onto the runway. Through the window, Madeline saw the runway stretching out, the late afternoon light casting a soft golden hue. She didn't blink, not the slightest hint of fear. Her hand tightened on the seatbelt, taking a deep breath as if preparing for a silent battle. The plane's wheels touched the ground with a gentle sound, and the engine noise began to slow. A few passengers clapped weakly, out of habit, but even that applause felt misplaced and awkward. No one laughed. No one spoke. Everyone was waiting to see how justice would step into the cabin. Madeline Carter remained seated, her hands neatly clasped together on her lap. Her phone in her jacket pocket vibrated lightly. A message from Commander Samuel Carter appeared. "They're at the gate. Just stay seated and wait for them." Without responding, Madeline gently placed her phone back in her jacket pocket, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Her jaw relaxed, her breath steady. But her gaze was sharp, cold, filled with a quiet strength. The determination born from knowing that this time the truth had caught up with the one who thought they would never pay the price. The plane slowly rolled toward the gate. Along the aisle, passengers began to turn their heads, not toward the window as usual, but toward the front, where Madeline sat, and the curtain that separated the cabin. In the small kitchen area, Ms. Sullivan stood frozen. Her back stiffened like a board, her face pale as wax. She had heard the captain's announcement, had seen the sidelong glances from the passengers, and felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her. Emily, from the opposite side, cast a quick glance at her before softly reminding, "You should get ready." Ms. Sullivan swallowed, asking again, though she already knew the answer. "Ready? For what?" Emily didn't reply, just silently turned away and continued arranging the trays. But that silence echoed louder than any words. The seatbelt sign dinged. Captain Mason Rivers's warm voice came through the intercom. "We have arrived. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop. Thank you for flying with us." Madeline didn't move. She didn't reach for her bag, nor did she stand up like the other passengers who were hurriedly preparing to leave the plane. She stayed still, waiting, as if she had been waiting for this moment throughout the entire flight. The airplane door opened with a sharp hiss. A few scattered noises from outside quickly fell silent. Then an airport security officer in uniform stepped in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his step steady, his face cold and emotionless. He didn't glance at the passengers, nor did he greet his colleagues. His gaze went straight to Ms. Sullivan. "Ma'am," he said in a clear, firm voice, "we need you to accompany us for an investigation." Ms. Sullivan's mouth moved, as if to speak, but no words came out. The officer took a step forward gently but firmly. "There's an official complaint, along with a notification from Federal Aviation Security. You will be questioned immediately." A low murmur spread through the cabin. A few passengers quickly pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages, but in reality, they were secretly recording. Ms. Sullivan tried to swallow her last shred of dignity and attempted to speak. I didn't mean any harm." The officer shook his head, gently cutting her off. "You'll have a chance to explain, but not here." No one in the cabin stood to help her. Not a single word of defense was spoken. She stood up straight, adjusting her uniform as though it were her final shield, then stepped into the aisle. Each of her footsteps on the red carpet felt like carrying 1,000 pounds. Those around her silently shrank away, their eyes subtly following her. Some passengers even tilted their bodies as if trying to see the scene they'd rather forget. As she passed seat 2B, Ms. Sullivan stole a glance down. Madeline's eyes met hers, calm, steady, without a word of accusation. But that gaze carried more weight than any indictment. Ms. Sullivan lowered her head, avoiding the look, hastily walking past. When the airplane door closed behind her, the cabin fell into a heavy silence. A quiet sigh echoed somewhere, as if everyone had just released the tension that had built up throughout the flight. Madeline leaned back in her seat, relaxing her body. She still hadn't spoken a word, but everything that needed to be said had already been etched into the minds of the passengers through her actions and silence. The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer the usual hurried bustle after a flight. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, grabbed their luggage, but every movement was awkward, unnatural. There were no more smiles exchanged, no more casual conversations, only a silence, thick with the awareness that they had witnessed something wrong and had done nothing. Madeline remained seated, adhering to her father's instructions, not in a hurry, not leaving her seat. She allowed the situation to unfold as it should, until the right people arrived. The man sitting in 3C, who had spent the entire flight pretending to read a newspaper, finally spoke in a low, hesitant voice. I didn't know you were someone important." Madeline turned her head slightly, her voice calm. "I'm not important. I just have a valid ticket." The man lowered his head, blushing. I didn't mean that." Madeline gave a faint, indifferent smile. "But that's how everything works, right? People only care when they know someone has power, not when they're dismissed, humiliated, only when it becomes inconvenient for them." The man couldn't find a response. He quietly stood up, grabbed his suitcase, and left in silence. Passengers began to shuffle off the plane. No one had the same carefree expressions they had at the start of the flight. Emily appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, her eyes searching. When she saw Madeline, she approached and spoke softly. "They've cleared the way out. If you want, you can leave now." Madeline nodded. "Are they still waiting out there?" Emily replied, "Yes." 2 airport security officers and a representative from the airline are waiting. They just want to assist you, not interrogate you." Madeline lifted her backpack from under the seat, slinging it over her shoulder, her posture straight. Her gaze swept over the cabin once more, then returned to the exit. Each step she took, she walked not quickly, but not hesitantly. Calm, resolute, just like how she had won throughout this flight, not through noise, but with an unshakable silence. Madeline Carter stepped off the plane, her shoulders squared, her gaze calm. She walked past the first-class seats, where passengers still sat, unsure whether to apologize, make small talk, or continue to remain silent as before. Most of them lowered their heads slightly, avoiding her gaze. A woman even rummaged through her purse, pulling out her phone to send a message, likely not to record the event, but to inform someone about what had just happened. As Madeline walked down the jet bridge, a cool breeze hit her face, a sharp contrast to the tense atmosphere on the plane. Waiting ahead were 2 uniformed airport security officers and a man in a Navy suit with an airline badge pinned to his chest. His stance was formal, his face restrained, but clearly respectful. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sergeant Carter, I'm Logan Mitchell from the airline's executive response team. We've been notified about the situation. Your father has requested complete transparency in the process and full accountability from the airline." Madeline didn't shake his hand, only nodded. "Lead the way." They began walking through the terminal. Airport staff and passengers instinctively stood straighter, stepping aside as the group moved through. No one asked questions. No one made jokes. Just seeing the 2 security officers escorting a calm military woman made it clear that something serious had occurred. They reached a frosted glass door with bold lettering, "Executive Lounge, Reserved Area." Logan paused, turned to speak quietly. "Your father is waiting inside. If you need legal counsel, a statement drafted, or any other support, we have everything prepared." Madeline looked at him and asked briefly, "Is she still employed by the airline?" Logan hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Currently, no. She's been suspended immediately pending the investigation." Madeline nodded, her voice calm. "That's just the beginning." Logan opened the door for her. Inside the executive lounge, the space was almost eerily quiet. Soft lighting bathed the high-end leather chairs. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. There was only one man seated at the farthest corner, back straight, legs crossed neatly, his hands resting on a closed file. Madeline's eyes immediately recognized her father, Commander Samuel Carter. He stood when he saw her, not hurriedly, but decisively. He walked over, opened his arms, and embraced her tightly. "Are you okay?" He only released her when she nodded firmly. "I'm fine. Better now." Samuel looked directly into her eyes, searching for any cracks, however small, but saw nothing but steadiness. He nodded gently, gesturing to the seat opposite. "Sit down. We need to talk." Madeline placed her backpack beside the chair and sat up straight, her gaze unwavering. There was no need to hurry. They were both accustomed to handling crises in silence, with logic rather than emotion. Samuel gently patted the file in front of him, his voice steady. "I've read the full report. I've seen the clips passengers recorded on the plane." He paused for a moment, his gaze sharp. "This story is spreading fast. The media will be all over it within 24 hours. Madeline didn't speak. She simply nodded, as if everything was unfolding just as she expected. Samuel continued, "The airline has issued an internal statement. They're trying to steer public opinion toward the idea of a procedural misunderstanding, hoping to squash it quickly." Madeline's eyes darkened slightly, but she still maintained her composure. "Of course. They wouldn't want this to turn into a scandal." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his gaze becoming even more cold. "But we won't let them bury this." He opened the file and slid it toward her. Inside were emails, incident reports, and a scanned boarding pass. All the clear evidence showing that Madeline had a valid first-class ticket. Her name and rank clearly printed. Madeline lightly ran her finger over the paper. "She didn't even bother to check," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "It's not that she didn't know how to check. It's that she didn't care." He paused for a moment, then slowly added, "She's been suspended. But that's not enough." Madeline looked up, her gaze sharp as a knife. "You want to fire her?" Samuel shook his head lightly. "This isn't about personal revenge. This is about the system." He leaned forward, his voice firm. "Firing her only solves the surface issue. She'll find another job at a different airline, and she'll mistreat someone else. We need to change the rules of the game." Madeline sat silently, a strong sense of agreement rising within her. Samuel outlined their goals clearly. "I want mandatory bias training for all flight attendants, an independent system for passengers to file discrimination complaints without fear of being ignored, a public apology, not just to you, but to all military personnel and passengers who've been disrespected." Madeline leaned back in her chair, a sense of clarity filling her. This time, they wouldn't just restore her honor. They would create real change. In the stillness of the room, Madeline Carter fixed her gaze on her father. She was well accustomed to his demeanor. Commander Samuel Carter never needed to raise his voice or pound the table. He simply set a goal and systematically made it a reality. "They will try to defend themselves," Madeline said, her tone calm. "And they will fail," Samuel replied without hesitation. Madeline remained silent for a moment, then picked up the ticket from the file, her eyes lingering on the clearly printed text. Seat 2B, her name, her rank. "All of this," she said in a low voice, "just because she looked at me and decided I didn't belong there." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "And now, she'll have to live the rest of her career with the question of why she did it." Madeline placed the ticket down on the table, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the folder. "She sent me an apology." Samuel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Did you reply?" Madeline pressed her lips together, responding, "I told her I wasn't angry. But I made it clear. This isn't just about personal feelings. I don't need an apology. I need change." Samuel's eyes flashed with satisfaction. He nodded, pride evident on his face. "That's the difference between you and them. They judged you by the first glance, but you held your dignity, even when no one stood by you." Madeline leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant, letting her mind drift for a few moments. "I never wanted all of this to happen," she whispered. "No," Samuel replied, his voice warm. "But sometimes the story chooses you." A soft knock sounded at the door to the lounge. Logan Mitchell, the airline representative, entered. He nodded respectfully. "We've cleared the terminal. The press hasn't flooded in yet, but they've started calling. Would you two prefer to use the private exit?" Samuel turned to look at his daughter. Madeline took only a second to respond. "No need. Let them see me." Logan didn't ask further, just nodded. "Understood." Samuel closed the file, standing up. He gave his daughter, the warrior he was proud of, a rare smile. "Let's go. Let them remember who you are." They walked out of the quiet lounge area, stepping into the harsh white light of the airport. The path to the gate seemed longer than Madeline remembered, but this time, each step she took was no longer burdened by resentment. With every step, she carried the truth, resilience, and most importantly, justice. Two airport security officers quietly walked on either side, offering no outward gestures, merely shadows escorting her. Logan moved quickly ahead, constantly answering calls, his face betraying clear tension. Though the airline had tried to control the situation, all their efforts to keep it under wraps had failed completely. Blurry videos capturing the moment Ms. Sullivan dragged Madeline out of her first-class seat were spreading rapidly on social media. At the terminal, passengers began to take notice. Some stopped in their tracks, staring. Others whispered to one another, their hands quickly tapping on their phones. A woman in a gray business suit lowered her head, whispering to her husband, her eyes never leaving Madeline. A young boy tugged on his mother's hand, pointing at Madeline, innocently asking, "Mom, is she famous?" His mother quietly hushed him, her eyes wide, not because she recognized Madeline's name, but because Madeline had become a part of a much larger story. Madeline didn't falter. Her chin held high, her walk steady. The military uniform she wore wasn't just a few pieces of fabric sewn together. It was a symbol of service, of self-respect, and now, of a public stand against injustice. As they approached the outside door, a young airline employee holding a tablet nervously stepped forward. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes," Samuel responded shortly. The young woman swallowed nervously, her voice tense. "The CEO is requesting an urgent meeting. He's hoping your family will consider discussing things privately before the news goes public." Samuel looked at his daughter. Without discussion, Madeline responded directly, "Tell them. I don't care about silence." The young employee almost stuttered. Yes, I'll pass it on." They continued toward the guest pickup area. The air outside was cool, the gentle breeze causing Madeline's coat to flutter. A black SUV was waiting at the curb, its engine running smoothly. Samuel opened the door for his daughter. Madeline stepped inside, sitting upright, her gaze directed out the window as her father also got into the car, and the door closed behind them. The car started moving, gliding through the busy streets, but it seemed like Madeline could no longer hear the noise outside. Life out there continued, people bustling, streetlights flickering, car horns blaring. But for her, everything had just changed. Not just for her, but for many others. After a few turns, Samuel broke the silence. "You know what will happen next, right?" Madeline nodded, her eyes still fixed on the window. "They'll issue a statement. She'll likely be formally suspended. They'll blame it on training errors or procedural mistakes." Samuel nodded firmly, his gaze unwavering. "And they'll hope the public forgets." Madeline turned her head to look at him. "But this time, we won't let them forget." He smiled, a smile not gentle, but heavy with meaning. "Exactly. Tonight we'll draft a policy proposal. I'll send it to the Department of Transportation." He looked straight at her. "You will write it with me. Every sentence, every word. Words have power, Madeline. And this time, you'll shape how the world treats people like you." Madeline didn't need to think twice. A silent but intense drive surged within her. This time, they wouldn't just end an injustice. They would start a change. Meanwhile, in a small room behind the airport, Ms. Sullivan sat alone, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. Her neatly pressed uniform now seemed nothing more than an empty shell. She had read the preliminary notice from HR. She knew the next steps wouldn't be easy. And it all began with that thoughtless glance. In the cold, empty room behind the airport, Ms. Sullivan sat motionless, her hands tightly clasped together on the cold metal table. No one said anything to her, but she understood all too well what awaited her: an investigation, a review, the possibility of being fired. But what weighed on her most wasn't the fear of losing her job. It was the undeniable truth. She had brought herself here. This was no longer a simple mistake. It was a choice, a bad choice. Every time she scrolled through updates on her phone, Madeline Carter's name appeared more frequently. Meanwhile, her own name, Ms., Sullivan was now associated with keywords she had never imagined: discrimination, misconduct, abuse of power. Her reputation, her career, her life, all that she had worked for, was slipping away second by second. And miles away, the woman she had once looked down on, now, was rewriting the rules so that no one else would have to endure the shameful silence that she had once experienced. Night had fallen over the city when Madeline arrived at her father's apartment. Outside, the skyscrapers sparkled with lights. The traffic hummed like the veins of a massive body. But inside the apartment, everything was neat and quiet, with a simple yet disciplined beauty where peace coexisted with steely resolve. Madeline changed out of her military uniform, donning a gray sweatshirt and simple jeans. No more outward glory, only authenticity, preparing for a new fight. She walked into the small office, where soft light illuminated the walls. On the desk was an open laptop, a stack of empty notes, and a half-drunk cup of black coffee. Samuel Carter was typing carefully on the keyboard, the sound of each keystroke ringing clearly in the quiet space. "They've issued a statement," he said without looking up. Madeline crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Let me guess. We regret the incident. We are committed to zero tolerance for discrimination. We are investigating." Samuel turned the screen toward her. The statement was clearly displayed. "We confirm an incident involving a crew member and a military passenger. We are conducting an internal investigation. The involved member has been temporarily suspended. We are committed to serving all passengers with respect and dignity." Madeline let out a hollow laugh. No joy in it. Still no mention of my name, and no acknowledgement of the specific wrongdoing. Samuel nodded, his voice dry. "They think they can buy time with a few empty words, by silence." Madeline stepped closer, her eyes alight with determination. "And you won't let that happen." He nodded firmly, pushing the stack of notes toward her. "I've outlined the framework. The rest. Write it in your own words." Madeline took the pen, feeling as if she were grasping a spear for the battle ahead. "What do you want me to write?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. "It's not what I want. It's what needs to be said." In front of her, the blank sheet stretched out like an open runway. Without hesitation, Madeline began to write. "Mandatory anti-discrimination policy for passenger transport. All passengers with valid tickets, regardless of appearance, attire, race, or assumptions about their status, have the right to sit in the seat they purchased. Any decision to relocate, inspect, or handle any passenger must be verified through two-step electronic validation and logged in the internal journal. Any violation, intentional or unintentional, will immediately be referred to an independent ethics committee for review. Vulnerable passenger groups such as military personnel, disabled individuals, and solo premium passengers should be given additional protective measures." Samuel watched her write, his face reflecting silent pride. She didn't write in anger. She wrote with clarity, with the belief that change was necessary, and that she was strong enough to bring about that change. Madeline paused, looking up at her father. "Do you think they'll listen?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes full of certainty. "They will have to listen, because this time the story is not being controlled by the airline. It is being told by someone who has lived through it." Madeline pressed her lips together and continued writing. Page after page, the pen moved quickly, breathing life into each sentence. From the living room, the TV news came on, the announcer's voice steady. "The passenger has been identified as Sergeant Madeline Carter, daughter of former Commander Samuel Carter, now a senior advisor on aviation policy at the Department of Defense. Video footage shows the flight attendant ordering her to move to economy class without verifying her identity, sparking outrage on social media." Samuel reached out to turn off the TV. No need to hear more. Both of them knew the story had far surpassed the confines of that small airplane. Madeline's phone buzzed lightly. A message from Kelsey, an old teammate still deployed overseas. "I saw the news. You're holding up like you always do. We're proud of you." Another message followed. "It's time for someone to stand up." Madeline stared at the screen for a long moment. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was the feeling of finally finding her place, not just on the airplane seat, but in the silent battle unfolding. She placed the phone down, a new resolve lighting up her eyes. "I want to speak," she said, her voice firm. Samuel looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Madeline replied without hesitation. "Not to defame anyone, but to remind them silence is also complicity. And I will not remain silent." Samuel smiled faintly, his gaze full of support. "Then let's make sure the world hears you." In that small room, far from the busy runways, a new voice was forming, strong, genuine, not just for her, but for all those who had been forced to remain silent. The city woke up the next morning not with silence, but with a storm of information. By 6 a.m., Madeline Carter's name was all over social media platforms. The secretly recorded videos from the plane cabin had surpassed 3 million views. Screenshots of the apology email Ms. Sullivan had sent were being dissected, analyzed word by word, with thousands of comments flooding in. From morning talk shows to veteran forums and news podcasts, there was only one question being asked: how could something like this still happen? Inside Commander Samuel Carter's apartment, the TV was already on. Madeline sat cross-legged on the sofa, wearing a loose sweatshirt, holding a cup of cold tea she hadn't taken a sip of. The announcer's voice mixed with the soft hum of the heating system. Sergeant Madeline Carter, who was forced to leave her first-class seat despite holding a valid ticket, will give her first public statement this afternoon. The airline in question is facing a fierce backlash and has issued a second statement acknowledging failures in their passenger handling process and promising a thorough review. Madeline reached out to hit the mute button. She didn't need to hear every update. She was the center of the story. Samuel entered the room, neatly dressed in a crisp white shirt. He was holding his phone, which was continuously receiving new messages. "We've received interview requests from 7 major TV channels, 2 national magazines, a documentary crew, and a congresswoman." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "A congresswoman? What does she want?" Samuel sat down across from her. "She wants to hear your perspective before introducing the passenger protection bill. This bill could be fast-tracked due to the effect of this story." Madeline sighed quietly. Just from one flight, one push. And now it's a wave. Samuel looked directly into her eyes, resolute. "It's not just one flight. Every time this has happened in the past, it was ignored. You're just the first one who didn't let it be buried." Madeline placed the teacup down on the table, her gaze firm. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want them to quietly bury the truth." Samuel nodded. "That's the difference." A knock echoed on the door. 2 sharp, quick raps. Madeline stood up and opened it. Standing outside was a woman in a light gray blazer, holding a soft yellow envelope. "Miss Carter?" the woman asked. "Yes. I've been authorized by the airline to deliver an official apology letter to you, signed by the CEO. You are not required to respond or accept it. My only task is to deliver it." Madeline took the envelope without saying a word. The woman nodded and turned, leaving as quietly as a breeze. Madeline closed the door, walked back to the sofa, and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly formatted letter. "Dear Sergeant Madeline Carter, we sincerely apologize for the incident that occurred on Flight 382. The treatment you receive does not reflect the values or standards upheld by our airline. We acknowledge the failure in passenger information verification and the inappropriate behavior of the crew member. We are committed to taking urgent measures to ensure such an incident does not happen again. You deserve respect. We deeply regret this incident. Sincerely, Harold Beck. CEO Madeline read the letter, her face betraying no emotion. The letter was well written, professional, courteous, but it came too late. She folded it back up and placed it on the coffee table, not touching it again. Samuel observed his daughter's reaction. "You're not satisfied." Madeline shook her head. "I'm not angry, but they still haven't acknowledged the real reason. No one dares to say it. This is discrimination. Until they call the issue by its true name, all apologies are just attempts to silence." Samuel nodded slowly. "Do you want to call it by its name?" Madeline looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Yes. And I want to do it today." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes alight with intensity. "Then let's prepare the speech." The next 3 hours passed in a high-intensity flurry of work. No wasted words, no empty slogans. Madeline didn't want to come across as angry or bitter. She wanted to stand there, strong, sincere, rational, a soldier who didn't need to shout to make people listen. By noon, they were at the small hall prepared by the local veterans organization. It wasn't a grand event. Just a few cameras, a simple podium, and a few rows of folding chairs. The audience consisted of reporters, bloggers, and a small group of active duty soldiers. They're not out of curiosity, but out of silent support. Madeline stood backstage, adjusting the button of her dark blazer paired with simple jeans. No rank, no medals. She didn't need those to prove her worth. A man holding a clipboard signaled, "Whenever you're ready." Madeline walked out onto the stage. The room immediately fell silent. The cameras shifted, and the lights focused on her. She stood at the podium, took a deep breath, and began. "I'm not here to defame anyone. I'm not here to destroy someone's career or a company's name. I'm here because I was treated as if I didn't belong in a place I paid to sit. And I know I'm not the first. I don't demand special privileges. I'm not seeking pity. I have a first-class ticket. I wear the uniform I've worked hard to earn. But all of that still wasn't enough. I was asked to leave, simply because of how I look, because of what someone assumed about me. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a dangerous misjudgment. And it happens too often, not just to military personnel, but to people of color, disabled people, the poor, the quiet, the proud. So today, I speak for myself, not just for me, but for all those who've never been heard. I don't ask for another apology. I've received it already. I ask for accountability, policy, a commitment that next time when a flight attendant sees someone who doesn't fit their idea of first class, they'll check their bias before checking the boarding pass. I belong there, we all do, and no seat number can define a person's worth. She paused. In the room, the silence was heavy, like a blanket draped over everything. Not because they didn't know how to respond, but because they knew. They had just heard something real, something necessary. Samuel walked up and gently placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, not to lead her away, but to show that he was here, by her side. The applause began, tentative at first, then growing louder, resonating throughout the room. Madeline didn't smile. She just stood there, back straight, calm, unwavering, and for the first time since Flight 382, she felt she had truly been heard. After the groundbreaking speech, the following days passed so quickly that Madeline Carter sometimes had to question whether she was dreaming. The video of her speech went viral, attracting millions of views worldwide within just hours. By evening, The video was shared by veterans organizations, human rights groups, aviation industry communities, major media outlets, and even prominent figures. But what Madeline received was not fame and glamour. It was a conversation larger than herself, larger than that fateful flight. Her inbox was nearly overflowing with messages from people she had never met. There were messages from soldiers who had quietly endured injustices. There were heartfelt words from parents, students, teachers, regular passengers, people who had never worn a uniform but had also been made to feel small at 30,000 feet. One message particularly left Madeline silent. It was from a retired nurse, Gloria Benton. "I once sat in first class with a ticket my son bought for me. A flight attendant asked me to show my ID. I was the only one asked. I was 74 years old. At the time, I didn't know how to stand up for myself. But seeing you, I feel like you did that for me. Thank you." Madeline sat staring at the screen for a long time, her heart tightening. She replied gently, "You never had to prove you deserved to be there. That seat was yours. I just regret no one told you that sooner." Behind the scenes, things were moving powerfully. Samuel Carter, with his usual sharpness, had swiftly submitted an official policy proposal to the Department of Transportation. With backing from advocacy groups and media attention, the proposal was receiving serious consideration. The proposal wasn't flashy, and it didn't promise overnight change. But it was specific, practical, and most importantly, co-written by Madeline herself. The proposal included mandatory bias awareness training for all airline employees with real-world situational testing, the establishment of independent oversight committees to review complaints related to passenger relocation or downgrading, the immediate implementation of electronic verification for any ticket disputes, the establishment of a system to protect vulnerable passenger groups such as military personnel, disabled individuals, or solo premium passengers. It was a clear, solid plan that would be hard to ignore. For the first time, Madeline felt that her voice wasn't just echoing, it was creating real change. However, not everyone was ready to move on from the past. One evening, when Madeline arrived at a small bookstore cafe to record for a podcast aimed at veterans, she happened to spot a familiar face. In the far corner of the cafe, sitting quietly with her head bowed over a cup of coffee, was Ms. Sullivan. Her hair was no longer tightly bound as before, her figure smaller, worn out from within. When their eyes met, Ms. Sullivan flinched. Madeline didn't approach. She didn't need to. The story between them had ended long ago. As she was about to leave the cafe, the manager unexpectedly walked up to her and handed her a folded piece of paper with shaky handwriting. "Dear Madeline," Madeline opened it and read each line. "I lost my job, and I know I deserve it. I just want you to know that I've started volunteering at a local community center. I teach children who have never been on an airplane. One little girl in class said she wanted to be a pilot, thanks to you. I will never forget what I did to you, but I promise it will not define me forever. I'm sorry. I always have been." MB Madeline folded the paper back up and put it in her backpack. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't need a conversation to end, because with that small piece of paper, she knew the change had begun. On both sides. In the weeks that followed, airlines across the country began announcing updates to their internal training programs. Some even invited Madeline to consult, but she declined most of the offers. She wasn't looking for the spotlight. She didn't need to become a symbol. She only wanted this story to do what it was meant to do, and then move on quietly. One morning, her phone rang. It was a call from her old unit. "We want to award you a commendation," the commander said. "Not for combat achievements, but for civilian courage." Madeline chuckled lightly. "I just stood firm on one flight." But deep down she knew sometimes, just standing firm at the right moment can shake the world. She received the commendation quietly, with her self-respect intact. And then she continued flying. Not because she no longer feared being judged, but because she wouldn't allow one bad flight to extinguish her dream of freedom. On the next flight, Madeline wore jeans, a simple t-shirt, and carried a small backpack. No uniform, no spotlight. Just a woman, with a ticket in hand. At the boarding gate, the employee smiled and greeted her. "Welcome, Miss Carter. Seat 2A. Have a pleasant flight. No scrutinizing glances, no suspicious questions." Madeline sat down in her seat, this time without anyone stopping her. She rested her head against the window, gazing out at the wide-open sky. She breathed deeply, offering a soft smile, not because she had won, but because she knew she would never have to prove she deserved it again. Spring came gently, the trees lining the roads blooming with white flowers. The sky grew bluer, brighter, and Madeline Carter's story continued to spread far. She was no longer just a viral name. She had become an icon. Although she had never sought fame, Madeline Carter carried her story with calm and resolve. Her life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. No more cameras shoved in her face. No more frantic calls from the media. Madeline returned to simple work. She took on a part-time contract job with a civilian military project, supporting combat readiness training programs. On weekends, she tutored children at a local youth center near her home. The rest of the time, she walked for hours in state parks, the only sound being the rustling of dry leaves beneath her feet. But her story, the echo of it, never truly disappeared. It occasionally returned, as gently as an accidental shoulder tap in the flow of life. An elderly woman in a supermarket timidly touching her elbow and whispering, "You gave me the courage to speak up at my workplace." A teenage boy at a bus stop recognizing her and asking, "Are you the one from that incident?" A man standing in line at the identification office, not asking for a photo, but simply nodding and saying, "Thank you for being strong." It wasn't fame. It was something deeper, respect, born from truth. One afternoon, Madeline received an invitation to attend the National Aviation Policy Forum in the Capitol. The event gathered directors, lawmakers, and prominent figures in the industry, all in their tailored suits with polished smiles. When Madeline walked onto the stage, dressed in jeans, her old military boots, and a simple blouse, the atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need to. She stood straight, her gaze steady, her voice calm, not as a victim, not as a media icon, but as a citizen, someone who had been politely rejected simply because of her existence. She began. "The seat I held that day wasn't just a number on a ticket. It was a symbol of the place I earned with my effort. I wasn't asking for special privileges. I wasn't trying to upgrade myself. I had a ticket. I had the right. But someone looked at me and saw nothing but a mistake." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. "That's the root of what we must fix. Not just policy, but perception. We can train thousands of employees, write hundreds of rules. But all of it will be meaningless if deep down, people still believe that some passengers need to be checked, while others are automatically welcomed. This issue isn't confined to one airline. It's not confined to one profession. This is a struggle between power and dignity. Power can be granted, but dignity, it must be recognized. Dignity is not a reward. It is every person's inherent right." As Madeline stepped down from the podium, the applause began, at first hesitant, then growing stronger, echoing throughout the room. That evening, after the forum, Madeline wandered alone through the bright streets of Washington, D.C. No purpose, no schedule. The honking of car horns, the murmur of voices, the laughter drifting from outdoor cafes. all blended together like the heartbeat of the city. She stopped at the National Mall, where the famous monument stood solemnly under the soft golden light. Madeline made her way to a bench across from the Lincoln Memorial. The stone statue stood still, like a guardian of timeless ideals. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to remember that moment, the moment on Flight 3A2. The moment when Ms. Sullivan placed her hand on Madeline's arm, telling her to leave, telling her she didn't belong. The pain of that moment still lingered, like a faint burn, but now it no longer defined who she was. She had redefined herself, a touch, an invisible judgment, a small moment, and from it an undercurrent rose, carrying with it things they never expected. Not through shouts, not through heated battles, but through sitting still, holding her ground, and not letting silence win. Across the reflective water, the American flag swayed in the night wind. The lights from the monuments cast their glow on the surface of the water, shimmering like quiet promises. Madeline Carter sat there, her hand resting on her lap, not smiling, but firm. No more apologies needed, no more declarations to wait for, only life. A life in which she had regained something no medal, no uniform could give her. The right to be seen, the strength to remain in place when the whole world tried to push her somewhere else. And with that quiet resolve, she had rewritten the rules, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong here. No more. Not ever again." In a world that constantly tries to define who is deserving and who is not, Madeline Carter has shown us. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm. You just need to believe that your dignity doesn't need permission. It already exists. A small action, a quiet determination, can shake the system. And then, you don't just claim your seat. You create a space for so many others. If this story touched your heart, please hit like, share this video with those who need it, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more inspiring stories together. See you in the next journeys.